of the night, something strange is going on.
You see that movie, Night of the Living Dead?
Sure.
They ship those bodies. Well, say hello.
The dead have risen from the grave.
Mister, there's 100 of those things out there.
How many did you say?
100?
And now the question is, how do we get them back into the ground?
Bert, Frank, we have a little problem.
4 left, 10 right.
It's all over everything! Stupid asshole! Watch your tongue, boy, if you like this job! Like this job! Brain!
Medical science is baffled.
And it's a puzzle, because technically, you're not alive.
Why do you eat people?
Not people. Brains.
How do you kill something that's already dead?
Well, how do I know, Fred? I don't know. Let me think.
It's not a bad question, Bert.
In that movie, they destroyed the brain to kill him. Is that what they did?
The brains, right? Brains!
Brain! The brain! I hit the brain! Oh! Get it off! 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 Get it off!
The military is nervous.
How was your day?
Usual crap.
The police are confused.
Send more cops.
It worked in the movie! Well, it ain't working now. Read the movie line!
It's not a bad question, Bert. It's not a bad question, Bert. It's not a bad question, Bert.
The return of the living dead.
And welcome to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast. My name is Jesse, and I'll be your host. Before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to the show on your podcatcher of choice, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to give the show 5 stars and a 1 to 2 sentence review, and tell me what you think. If you'd like to follow the show on social media, you can do so on Instagram at Cult Cinema Circle, or on Twitter at Cult Cinecircle, or you can send me an email at cultcinemacircle@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Letterboxd at Jesse Kremp, JESSEKREMP, all one word, and all social media links will be put in the show notes. Now on with the show. And welcome back, y'all. So today we're going to be trying to go to You Need a Medical Supply, to get some split dogs, I guess. And we're also going to be also running for our lives from these zombies that really just want our brains. With all that being said, though, we are in the thick of spooky season right now, okay? And so I thought it would be very, very apropos, if anything, to cover a little film from 1985 called Return of the Living Dead. Now, this movie, first and foremost, is definitely like a centerpiece of cult cinema and cult horror, if you will. So I couldn't just do this all by myself, though, because no. I needed to bring someone here who also really likes this movie as much as like I do, I think, but who, has quite a bit more experience with it and has seen it probably more times technically. And he's also just like a dear friend who I've actually been on his show before, and I wanted to bring him on mine. So you know him from the Cultworthy Cinema podcast and also Back to the Balcony, where they him and a friend of his talk about Siskel and Ebert reviews from back in the day, back when they had their own TV show. But please welcome to my show. You've also heard him if you listen to Release Rewind podcast he was doing an episode about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which was a fantastic episode. But with all that being said, please welcome to my show, Antonio Palacios. Did I get your last name right, Antonio?
It's Palacios, but you got the pronunciation right, just the wrong consonant. But
it's fine. Whatever. It's so nice to talk to you. Like, how are you doing?
I'm great, man. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I mean, it's funny because we've talked about this since I want to say April of earlier in the year.
Yes, because I was on your show. Yep.
Yeah, you were on my show like in April, May, and like, okay, Halloween time, we're going to start doing these scary movies. We were talking about Return of the Living Dead for a while, and now we're doing it.
Absolutely.
I'm so happy about that.
I know. Actually, I was thinking a little behind the scenes, listeners. So I was actually, because my show my release date fell on July 3rd this year. And so I was thinking of actually doing it then, but you actually told me, you were like, hey, let's stay off on it a little bit. It might be better during spooky season. And I completely agree. So we were going to do it in spooky season anyway, but I thought like, oh wait, no, we can move it. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And then you were like, oh no, let's keep it for a little bit. I was like, all right, Antonio, I got you. I feel you. I see you. But yeah, it makes more sense.
You were going for like that deep cut of like people have to know the movie takes place on July 3rd, right?
Right. I was kind of like the people who know, right?
They know, yeah.
But also, if you're listening to this in the future, you should also listen to on July 3rd, whenever that is. So
right. Watch the movie on July 3rd and then re-listen to the show on July 3rd.
Exactly. It's a great July 4th movie, to be honest with you. But Antonio, as we start today, tell me, give us your socials up at the top, and also tell me a little bit about your shows that you do. And also with that, I want to hear a little bit about your history with this film. Like, when did you first see it? And what is it about it that, just makes it kind of one of your faves, I guess. I would love to hear about that.
All right, let's get socials and all that nonsense out of the way. So find me at thecultworthy.com. That's my website where it has links to everything I do. Blogs, podcasts. It's got links to all of my favorite guest hosts, just like the Cult Cinema Circle here. And you can also see all the links to my other shows, which, like you said, we're Back to the Balcony, and a show that's on hiatus right now called The MILF and Me. It's not a movie podcast. It's a kind of dating in your 40s podcast. So if you're a millennial Gen Z, you probably don't care, but it's a good time. But then on the socials, X/Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, you can find me at The Cultworthy. So that's where you can find all the good stuff, man. And the movie. Yeah. So this is just, it's such a quintessential zombie movie of the 80s, right? Because we did have a good chunk of zombie films in that decade. But I think because most of them didn't follow the Romero rules of zombies, some people in the horror community kind of turned their nose up at them. And then over time, they grew these cult followings, and people just kind of came to the point where we don't need a precise set of zombie rules, just like we don't need a precise set of vampire or werewolf rules anymore. Like, you can create your own rules, and that's what this film kind of does. And I'm going to get into that later in the conversation, but I think of all the zombie flicks that came out that were non-Romero in the 80s, this is the one that really kind of just springboarded the whole new kind of counterculture punk rock attitude that the zombie films could have. And it even built a franchise off of it. Not as successful as the first one, but it did create, in my opinion, a cult-worthy franchise of zombie movies.
Completely agree. I absolutely with all you're saying, and all the socials will be in the show notes, by the way, as well, everybody. But yeah, I completely agree with you because, yeah, I mean, and we could talk about that as well, where it's like, yeah, we did have 80s, zombie movies and all, but I do think that this one it's different because, yeah, we don't have to follow those same quote rules that had been kind of established with zombies in general back in the day, even in the 30s and 40s. But even with something like Romero, which this is obviously very much tied to, but because of who wrote it and all this, but really it's like, yeah, you could go out and the zombies are doing it for themselves. You know what I mean? And that's always just super fun. So yeah, totally. And my history with this movie is actually pretty recent. I hadn't really watched it when I was growing up or even as a budding horror fan or whatever. And I became aware of it because I even Night of the Living Dead, I hadn't seen it. It took me a while to watch that. And so I was like, oh no, this is a really good movie. Like I should totally see it. And then when I found out Return to the Living Dead, I was like, oh, what is this? And then as soon as I watched it for the first time, I was just like, oh, this is my shit. This is
more
like
my style.
Because as much as I think Land of the Living Dead is such a fantastic movie and it's really good and all that good stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like this, just my sensibility of like there's funny, there is scary, and all of this going in there. I mean, that's why this works a little bit more for me. And I mentioned it in my Letterboxd review, but I think that whether or not a film wants to say so or not, after this film, like a lot of zombie films after this are hearkening back to Return of the Living Dead, really, in my opinion.
I agree.
But,
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's intentional or not, it's hearkening back, and I think that's a testament to how cool it was. So
and multi-generational too, right?
Agreed. Yeah.
Like for me, this was something that I caught staying up way too late as a kid, like maybe 8 or 9 years old on TV. So it was edited. It was not as violent. Right. There was no, naked trash dancing on a crypt, all those different things. So my dad would always go get me movies if I was sick and home from school. And I had a bunch that I'd always like send him to get. Like, I want Aliens. I want the first Highlander. I want Return of the Living Dead. And the first time he brought it home, it was like, oh, I get the good version. Oh, there's boobies in this. Oh, there's brains in this. And there's a bunch of gore that wasn't in the TV version I saw. And they didn't give a shit. I think my dad probably sat and watched it with me. And that's why I think I'm so the way I am in my appreciation of cinema, is because I wasn't censored to the point where I didn't have an appreciation for things when I saw them later, right? I feel people who live sheltered lives, they almost are like intimidated by, oh, I don't want to watch that movie because I wasn't allowed to when I was younger. And then my parents were just like, oh, you can watch Night of the Living Dead with us. Okay, if you want to watch another Living Dead movie, fine. If you have nightmares, that's your own problem. That's not my problem. That's kind of how it was. And when I say multi-generational now, it's like, as a kid in the 80s, you wanted to be one of these crazy teenagers. And then like when you see it as a crazy teenager, you're like, okay, yeah, that is my crowd. Then when you see it, you're older, like, God damn, these teenagers are out of control. I'm now more connected to the Clu Gulager role, right?
Absolutely.
It matures with you, especially Gen X and up, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is something where, and what's cool about it too, is that I feel like for anybody who is maybe interested in horror or who is interested in wanting to get into it, but maybe has never seen a ton of horror movies, I truly think that this is kind of it's a good way to get someone started, because like, for all intents and purposes, like, yes, it's a zombie movie and yes, these zombies want brains, but like, it's not like super disturbing or anything. And because there's comedy in there, you can't take the whole thing seriously. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's also helpful for people who maybe are trying to get into the genre. And I'm like, yeah, you could watch like Night of the Living Dead and that's great and all, like, but also it's super sad because of the ending, kind of. But like this one, I'm like, yes, this is also sad because of the ending a little bit, but it's at least more funny. And I think that can help people who, are maybe like, well, what kind of zombie movies should I watch? That's not like, whatever the hell, right? So I would even say somebody who's getting into horror, I think Return of the Living Dead would be a great intro to something, because like you said, it has tits, it's got brains, it's got all the things, but it has that kind of fun that sometimes the Friday the 13th franchise has a little bit.
Yeah,
but it also has like the zombies though, which is really fun. Yeah, well, I agree.
Think of it this way too, man. Like, yes, this one is a lot more satirical, a lot more tongue-in-cheek. There's camp, there's farce, there's funny, but what it does that the Romero films didn't do is it has a sense of empathy and sympathy and sentience to these zombies. So they're not just mindless hordes like in the Romero movies. And Romero finally kind of like fixed that in the third one, where he had Bub. Bub the zombie was like his sentient zombie that you could have like a sympathetic and empathetic attachment.
I love that little zombie so much with his little headphones.
His little headphones and his salute at the end. Yeah, he's probably one of the best zombies of all time. But in this one, we actually get to realize that being undead is agonizing. You're in pain, you're suffering. You can feel yourself rot.
Exactly.
And the only thing that can satiate you and feel better is eating live brains. So I loved that twist on this, is because now we understand where these undead creatures are coming from psychologically, right? But also it increases the stakes of I'm not going to get killed, torn apart, and then eaten. They want to eat my brain while I'm still alive.
Exactly.
That really ups the stakes. And I think it's like where Dan O'Bannon really brings some genius into the screenplay of this. I'm going to make some more connections later, but to me, that's what makes this like on an extra level than the Romero films, is that you have an empathy for the characters and the survivors and the victims, but you also have an empathy for the undead creatures because they're given sentience. They're given a chance to talk. The poor, just rotting, torn apart lady on the table saying that she can feel herself rot, and it's agonizing. It's a really poignant moment in a crazy horror movie, and I love that.
Exactly. I agree too. Yeah, this movie is awesome. It's so cool. But yeah, let's get into a little bit about the figures of this film and like just a little bit of that background. So I guess before we get into the figures of this, I do want to talk just a little bit to kind of set the stage a little bit. So, Antonio, I want to have a little bit of your opinion on this too. What do you think the state of like a zombie movie in the early 80s was looking like before we had something like Return of the Living Dead? What are we looking at in terms of that? If you had to, kind of to give your educated, opinion on it.
Well, it's interesting because I just did a review, which will be out in October, like this one will be, of Night of the Creeps and Night of the Comet. And Night of the Comet came out a year before this. And it's not as much a zombie movie. It's more of like an astro mutant zombie movie.
Correct.
But it does kind of follow the same tropes of like there's a survivor element, right? It's that Resident Evil. You have very little weaponry. You have very little in terms of sustainability and rations of food and stuff like that. But it also kind of glamorizes it with more like how Dawn of the Dead did with the consumerism of the mall. It's like, hey, the world's gone. Let's go shopping kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then there were like some of the lower budget kind of teenage zombie movies or undead movies that didn't really make it big. It didn't make a splash.
Exactly.
And I think one of the reasons why this did make a splash, it's a good movie and it had some notoriety and the talent behind it.
Exactly.
But you've got the title, of the Living Dead. And the reason why they were able to use that, as everyone in the horror world should know, is that Romero's crew did not copyright Night of the Living Dead as a film when it came out.
Right.
That's why it's all over TV. There's multiple versions on DVD and VHS and blah, blah, blah. And anybody, including the Italians, could call it Night of the Living Dead 2, Night of the Living Dead 3, or in this case, Return of the Living Dead. And even though it's not licensed, like attached as a license to the original, it's got the title, but it also does like a cool meta thing where it spiritually connects to the original and uses, hey, you ever seen that movie? Well, that movie was a cover up for a real incident that happened with the army. That's an awesome setup because you're instantly giving homage to the original and being able to create your own world off of that idea. And so I think that is where the state of the zombie movies were in the early 80s, was everyone was trying to do their own thing as to not get in trouble by being too close to the Night of the Living Dead. And here's this one where it's like, hey, we got the title. We're making a spiritual connection to it. So if you like that movie, at least it'll get you into the theater to see this one.
Totally agree. Yeah. Look at you with your education up in here. I love it. It's great.
It's because like I have a podcast or something.
I know, right? But yeah, it's just like I completely agree with that because you have that. You also have like Fulci with Zombie 2 technically, and that's what we're looking at. But like, that was the state of zombie movies, and that's definitely different. And we'll talk more about just like the connection between Night of the Living Dead and this film a little bit later. But it's definitely something where I think that is what the state was, and this is why it made Such a splash. But let's get into these figures, y'all. So, Return of the Living Dead. This was released August 16th of 1985 by Orion Pictures. Okay, good old Orion Pictures. In the same sort of Vestron video type thing, and those kinds of things. Even New World Pictures definitely as well. I kind of feel like a little bit. But yeah, Orion kind of is right there in there too. 91 minutes, so it's perfect get in, get out, and it was only $3 or $4 million of a budget, which is kind of insane to think about. Our opening weekend ranking gross for the box office it came in at number 4 with about 4.4 million. Overall, it made about so domestically, when it first premiered, it came out to 14.2 million, and then it got apparently re-released in 2022 and internationally, and it made $932. I don't know where it went. I think it went to Australia or something, but overall, according to the wonderful Box Office Mojo, it made ultimately worldwide $14.2 million. So not too bad when you're only working with like a low ass budget pretty much. And then ratings wise on Rotten Tomatoes, we have 91% from critics out of 46 reviews and a 79% on the popcorn meter. That's what they call the audience meter now, but the popcorn meter with 50,000 ratings. And the people on Letterboxd, the voice of the people, say 3.8 out of 5. I think it should be a little bit higher, but I'm cool with that though, in my opinion. But yeah, what do you think about some of those like box office stats and maybe some of the critic stats, if anything? Do you have anything to say about those?
I mean, that was a hit. That was a hit financially for what it is. These days, you're not a hit unless you make $1 billion because
Completely.
we're spending $500 million or $500 million on these movies. So, that's one of the biggest things I preach on this show is that, hey, whatever happened to the days where like you could make 10 times what the budget was, and that might only be $30-40 million, but that's still a hit. That means you're a success financially for the studio. So they should be making more of those. Like, don't be Warner Brothers and make these big multi-million dollar movies that you end up just canceling and using as tax write-offs. Like, make a bunch of smaller pictures and get people into the theaters to see things other than Deadpool Wolverine, right? Like, that's
great.
The theater right by me. It's a 3-plex, right? It's had Wolverine, Deadpool, and Alien Romulus for 3 weeks and nothing else. So it's just like, okay, what are we doing here? Yeah, we want to keep making those monies, but meanwhile, there's little movies that are just kind of slipping away, like Strange Darling's not playing anywhere by me.
Exactly.
That's a travesty.
It is, yeah. And plus, you're for listeners who may not know, Antonio is in Utah, Salt Lake City, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so he is in the middle of Mormon country. So yeah, pray for him. Okay. He's cool there though. But like, yeah, but it's one of those things where absolutely like a place like Utah does not always have everything. We had all of those closures of different movie theaters and the Alamo Draft House, like closed all over the place and stuff. And, people just aren't going to the theaters anymore. And I understand why. The theaters are kind of wild at this point. But yeah, you want to be able to watch something like Strange Darling or be able to watch something like any of these other movies that have come out. Like for me, like I'm waiting until like Alien Romulus like streams because I'm like, you know what? I don't feel like going to the theater personally. And that's not because it's not cool, but it's because other people are weird. And I don't always like that. So kind of depends. Will my ass be there for Wicked? Probably, most likely. But it's my duty to do that. So before we move into like some of the history, we're not going to bore you, I promise, hopefully. Let's talk a little bit about this cast and this crew. So we got to talk a little bit about Dan O'Bannon. We'll talk about him a little bit later, I think, but he is the director of this film. He did Bloodbath and The Resurrected. Those are the only other things he directed. Because let's just say, maybe he shouldn't have been the director of this movie. He did a great job. However, working for him was a mixed bag, it seems like. This is what I'll say. And we'll get more into that a little bit. So yeah, and he's also the writer of this as well. It was a story from John Russo, though, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But in my notes as a writer for Dan O'Bannon, I just say fucking all the Aliens movies, I guess, because it's true. Like, he literally wrote Alien. He also was a part of writing the other movies in Aliens. So, I'm sure he made a nice little bag, hopefully, from that. But yeah, that's what but he ended up writing this from, the story that John Russo had done as well. You have anything else to say about Dan O'Bannon before we talk more about him with the production of this?
He also had a nifty little side gig in the 80s, and he would do the novelizations for tons of movies.
Yeah, you're right.
Horror movies, sci-fi movies. He did the novelization for Aliens, which James Cameron wrote, and a lot of people say that his novelization was actually better storytelling-wise than the film. And I agree. Nice. I remember reading that when I was a kid. But yeah, he also did that too.
Nice. I love that. Look at you. Composer for this is Matt Clifford. So he's really only known for doing this, I think, which is, hey, cool with me. The soundtrack rules.
He killed it and is like, I'm done. I'm not going to top this.
Yeah, this is fucking rules, dude. It's great. Cinematographer is Jules Brenner. He actually shot Salem's Lot from 1979, the TV movie that was like 3 hours long. We're also finally getting Salem's Lot this year, everybody. So let's go and watch it.
Another one.
I want to see it. I'm probably going to watch it because I've never even seen the regular Salem's Lot. So I'm going to watch this one and just see about it. I know it's about vampires and I'm excited. Plus, it's been like, even Stephen King was like, bro, why is it so delayed? I don't understand.
Right.
Like, what's going on here? He also did Teen Wolf 2, the sequel to Teen Wolf as well. So that's fun. And then the editor is Robert Gordon. He then went on to do The Blue Lagoon, which he had done before this movie. And he also helped edit Toy Story as well. So that's fun. Anybody else on the crew that you kind of wanted to shout out or anything like that?
No, those are the main ones, man. Like, it was a low budget production and probably like a real pickup crew. Orion probably just had like a lot of people like just already that were working on other projects and they just jumped in and did this. So.
Yeah, totally. We also have, I think it's Tony Gardner, who was part of the special effects, I believe, because I just watched More Brains not too long ago. So we had that. We also had Kenny Myers, I think his name was. Am I right on that? I think. He was also one of the other special effects artists. And don't worry, we'll talk about Bill Munn when we talk a little bit more about the production of this movie, because that's also very interesting. But let's talk about some of these actors. As we already stated, Clu Gulager, rest in power, King. I love you. I mean, he did Western movies, like cowboy movies.
170 credits or something, if I remember correctly.
Crazy. He's The Last Picture Show. Yep, The Last Picture Show. He's that's Altman, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Bogdanovich.
Okay, gotcha. I always mix them up. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, of course. He's in The Initiation. It's fantastic. He's rest in power. I love him. And he also was a no shit kind of dude, take no shit kind of person, it seems like. So I love that for him. James Karen, who is most well known for being the guy who moved the headstones but not the bodies from Poltergeist. He's that guy.
He's that guy. He's like one of those that guy actors.
Yes, absolutely.
James Karen, Dick Miller.
I love Dick Miller.
They just own those 70s and 80s movies of it's that guy, and he's usually a bad guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll get to him in a little bit, I'm sure.
I'm sure. He also seemed really, really sweet on that More Brains documentary, to be honest. Yeah. He was also in Mulholland Drive. Do you remember who he was in Mulholland Drive? I don't remember. Was he just one of the suit guys? Maybe.
Yeah, I think is he in the diner scene at the beginning? I can't remember.
He might be. I don't know.
For me, my favorite role of his, honestly, is he is the office manager in Wall Street. He's Charlie Sheen's boss that walks around with that little cane, his little affectation, and he's such a memorable guy for such a small role.
Yeah.
That and that's what he does. He comes in, he owns a scene or two, and then he fucks off, and it's perfect.
It's perfect. It's great. He's so good. Don Calfa plays Ernst in this, or Ernest, I guess. Ernie, I guess. But
they call him Ernie.
They call him Ernie, but yes, that's his name. He is from Dr. Dolittle. He was also in Weekend at Bernie's as well. Very character actor. I love how in that documentary on the 4K Blu-ray, he has the thickest Brooklyn accent or New York accent ever. And I love that for him. It's amazing.
So great.
Oh, he's so good. I loved him. So those are our adults, I guess. And then our kids, quote unquote, these are all 20 somethings. We have Tom Matthews in his pretty much first ever role. He had been on TV before in a couple things, little background things here and there, little bit parts. And then he did this movie. And then the next year he was literally Tommy Jarvis. Yep. So There you go. It's a way. It's a living, man. But love that for him. And he's fantastic. He's super hot in this, by the way, number one. And number two, like he is fantastic because he gives me those soap opera like looks in a way, like those kind of hunky vibes, but also like, I don't know. Freddie's kind of a great little himbo, I feel like. And I always love a himbo.
I will agree with you on that, because he is kind of like, he's essentially the male lead, right? He's the protagonist of the younger group of kids. And he also has like the biggest sacrifice to make later on and like a characterization turn. And that's one of the things that makes this movie so good. And that happens with some zombie movies, but this is, he's the perfect example. Most zombie movies, when the protagonist gets turned, he's just a mindless zombie, has no performance, right? He's just lurking and but in this film, when you turn, you have to go through the agony of turning. It's almost like Jeff Goldblum in The Fly. It's almost like some of those werewolf movies where now we get to feel the pain of the person that we spent the first half of the movie creating a relationship with, and now we're watching him die, essentially. It's fantastic.
Exactly. It's really good. And I think he does a great job at this. Linnea Quigley, who, of course, she's B-movie royalty. I love her. She's one of my favorites. Oh, she's the queen. Silent Night, Deadly Night, which is how she got this role pretty much. We'll talk about it.
She gets impaled on some deer antlers.
Yes, she does.
Perfect. Whilst topless.
Whilst topless with the perfect titties. We'll talk about it. I know, right? Even as a gay, I always love a good pair of titties. I'm just saying.
She's got them.
She's got them. It's great. Nightmare Sisters, which I also love. Like, I think that's fantastic. I love that more than Sorority Babes and Slimeball Bolorama personally. But yeah, she's just fantastic. I love her. Miguel A. Nunez, who I also love. I also think he's like pretty much the sort of second lead in this movie, and I think he's fantastic. He is from also Friday the 13th Part 5, and he's wonderful in that movie as well.
Those
and
damned enchiladas.
Oh, those damned enchiladas. I love him. Scooby-Doo. You know what's so funny? I loved the Scooby-Doo movie. It came out the day like before my 10th birthday in 2002, and literally like, and I loved that movie when I was growing up, and I didn't realize until years later that he is the guy in it. Like, he's a guy in it, and I was like, oh my god, it's Miguel A. Nunez. That's awesome. Yeah, love that for him. King, love him. I wish he would do, I know he probably does conventions. Miguel, come out east a little bit more. I know you're from North Carolina. Like, just come and do it. Like, I would meet him. Like, I would totally be like, can you sign my Return of the Living Dead DVD, please? Like, my Blu-ray. Yeah.
Carpool with Linnea or something. Like,
I know. She doesn't come out here as much either for me. And I'm just like, girl, you need to. I'm just saying.
Right.
Whatever, it's fine. And then Mark Venturini, who is from Friday the 13th Part 5. He kills a supposed pedophile in that, so that's fun. Or just a really annoying guy with chocolate, I guess. He unfortunately has passed away. He died of leukemia. It was very sad.
Sad.
I will also say we do have to kind of mention the elephant in the room, that Brian Peck is in this movie as well, playing Scuzz. He is disgusting and a child predator. So that's really that. So that's all I have to say about it. He was involved in this movie quite a bit with like background stuff and like behind the scenes stuff. He's obviously in it. That's what I have to say about that. Like, I still want to. The less said, the better. I'll still watch this movie and love it. I still want to watch The Last American Virgin. He's in that too. Fucking sucks.
Which I just watched today because I have Diane Franklin on my show.
Fuck yeah.
In 2 days from now.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. She seems like the sweetest. I have a friend who does the New Jersey Horror Con. Shout out, Bobby. He's met her before and said that she was nice. So
yeah, I can't wait.
Also, I will say too, I have said before, I love Bill and Ted, as you may know. And I kind of was whatever about the princesses. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm still kind of whatever about those princesses, to be honest, but I'll make a case for at least Diane Franklin was there. So I love that for her. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But I'm not like the hugest on those characters, especially since they changed like throughout all those movies. But whatever.
Right. How dare they?
How dare they? They could have also kept Diane Franklin around. It's fine, but like whatever. But she is a queen. She seems great. So I'm, I hope that goes well for you.
Yeah, me
and
too.
go check that out on Antonio's channel when it goes up. Definitely. But yeah, so that is what I'll say about that. Is there anybody else on the cast that you wanted to like kind of mention or talk about before we move into like a little bit of a history lesson about this film?
No, I mean, because one thing this movie does is it picks its heroes and it sticks with them. You don't get a lot of interrupting characters. I'd say the only other one that kind of shows up and has some meaning is Colonel Glover, played by Jonathan Terry.
Yep.
If there's a person that is actually someone that we're supposed to kind of relate to at all, it's him. He's the mouthpiece for the government. That's his role.
Right.
Everyone else is kind of disposable. But yeah, no, you covered that group pretty well.
Yeah, I also forgot about Tina, and that's all I have to say.
I think
guess.
you're supposed to.
Like, honestly, that's no slight to Beverly Randolph, I guess. But like, also, I'm like, yeah, I think you are supposed to, because if it was up to me, this would just be about fucking Spider. Honestly, like he's way more interesting. Like, like whatever. But yeah, that's my thought on it, I guess. So let's dive into a little bit of just the background of how this movie came to be exactly. So as we already stated, like this is Night of the Living Dead it wasn't a huge movie when it came out. It was George A. Romero and him doing it up in Philadelphia, where he's from, PA, as you do.
Mm-hmm.
And he co-authored that script, Night of the Living Dead, with a man named John A. Russo. It's funny that they both are George A. Romero and then John A. Russo. They kind of have like little rhymings a little bit. Anyway, they co-authored this story. That movie ended up becoming kind of a cult hit, if you will, I guess, because it would play at midnight and stuff like that. So I put it in the canon, even though it is on the Criterion Collection and it's a very classic film now. Did a lot going on, and yeah, it's great. Now, what happened was John A. Russo, he ended up he got a novelization together called Return of the Living Dead, which is not this movie. It's a different story pretty much. But he did start that. And as you were stating earlier, they had to do a little bit of a split. A lot of people want to pit them against one another. However, John A. Russo has said multiple times that he and George Romero were perfectly fine. Like they don't hate one another or anything. They didn't hate one another. I think they're probably both. I know George A. Romero's dead. I think John A. Russo is dead too now. They were both kind of old anyway. But he always kind of said like, hey, no, we did not hate each other or anything. But they did have to split it down the middle, as you do. Mm-hmm. So what they had was that George A. Romero could use Of the Dead, I think. So that's why you have like Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, stuff like that. And John had the ability to use Of the Living Dead, which is why we have Return of the Living Dead, not Dawn of the Living Dead. You get what I'm saying? So that's kind of how they split it up, it seems like. But yeah, so that's kind of how it came from there. And really, I think once they had the novelization, do you have more information about how this kind of came to be like, okay, cool, we're going to turn this into a movie, I guess? Because I don't know if I have much information. Like,
no, I really don't.
Available.
I mean, that's essentially how they were able to kind of just get the springboard of
Right.
the concept, like, how are we going to make a new Living Dead movie and separate ourselves from the Romero canon?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was the big thing, is like, how are we going to do this? But I think what ended up happening is this fell into the hands of, I guess, somebody at Hemdale Film Corporation. That's what ended up happening. So as you stated, we had this sort of thing. And what ended up happening, though, is John Russo and a producer by the name of Tom Fox, who was not in the movies at all. He was an investment banker, pretty much. They ended up, but this Tom Fox guy wanted to get into movies, and he wanted to be a producer, for some films. So he ended up saying, all right, I'm going to put some money behind this. We're going to make Hemdale Film Corporation. That's what we're going to do. And that's going to be my little production company I'm going to make. And it was supposed to be that this movie was going to be in 3D. And also it was supposed to be directed by Tobe Hooper at first. That was what we were going to do. So when Hemdale experienced some difficulty getting the funds for this, because that's what happens in movies, and it delayed the start of production because they were going to start producing this in, I think, probably the probably early to mid 80s, probably 84 is when they started this. But even before that, they were trying to bring it to life. Hooper had to back out of it because he was just like, listen, I can't keep waiting around on this movie. I have this other movie called Life Force coming, and I need to go beyond that instead, which is where we have Dan O'Bannon coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So Dan O'Bannon, who had co-written Life Force, was then brought in to give he kind of did like a polish, or I don't know if it's the same thing, but a little bit of script doctoring, if you will, kind of sort of like, again, a little bit punch up, if you will. And because they were like, hey, we want to get this show on the road, it was asked like, hey, do you want to just direct this movie? And he's like, yeah, sure. The only thing he accepted it on was the fact that he's like, all right, I'll do it, but I want to rewrite this so that it's completely different from the Romero movies, but also like, that's the only reason I'll do it, because what you've written, what the original stuff is, like from the book that Russo did, it's not going to work as a movie. So I'm going to rewrite this, and then we'll make it happen, pretty much. And that's how the movie came to be, really. And that's how they got it together. But it really was just like some investment banker guy was like, hey, I like your little story. Here's money. Let's do something with it, pretty much. That's exactly what happened.
And that's how you got things done back then.
Yeah.
You know, like major studios didn't make movies like this. They bought movies like this.
Exactly.
So you would go and you'd find yourself a banker. You'd go find yourself one of the groups that they really love to do is they like to go after food and beverage companies.
Yep.
Food and beverage companies that had like, there's some like surplus money, and they do these investments in movies and then get returns on them.
Yep.
It's also why there's a bunch of movies that we won't see physical media release on forever, because they still exist in like the bottom line of some beverage company that doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
And no one can find like who is like the executor of this contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
So many movies that were happening like that in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, that was very common back then.
It was very common. Yeah. So yeah, they had this go into production. They were like, all right, cool. We got Dan O'Bannon here. He's written this shit. He's going to direct this shit. We need a cast. So for Bert, who ended up being Clu Gulager, that was like down to the wire, because they had Leslie Nielsen, who had been offered, but he declined this. Also, Robert Webber, he hated the script and passed on it as well. And actually, Scott Brady, who was an older actor, was considered, and they wanted to offer it to him, but he was actually very sick at the time, because James Cameron had just done a movie with him, actually. And he literally was like, yeah, no, he's like literally sick. Like he's probably
dead.
Gonna die. Like, he's probably going to be dying like soon, because he was sick on the movie I did with him. So he died not too long after this movie started production, really. He died in 85, I think. So it wasn't that long after. But Clu Gulager, he was the casting director of this, had thought of him anyway. And it really kind of, I think, just came down to like, all right, I guess I'll do it. Why not? And that's what Clu Gulager did, because he pretty much came from, he had done The Initiation, I think the year before this, probably the same year actually that had come out, and he had done this, because that was 84. So this was shot in 84. And then, he went right from this probably onto the return, the Freddy's Revenge set, probably, because he looks the same, obviously. But
yeah, he was a Western or like TV procedural guy for just decades. And he did spend like the 80s either in low budget horror or some low budget comedies, where I think most people now recognize him from those movies than they did from his TV work. So it was a good career move for him to get himself into this kind of like genre filmmaking.
Exactly. We already talked about Tom Matthews. He came in and he just blew the casting director away. He got the role. He had done some TV gigs and he had an uncredited role in a film, really, at this point. And then from here, he then went on to be Tommy Jarvis in at least one of the movies for Friday the 13th. And that's what he's kind of like staked his claim on, really. He's done some other things since then, but he will always be remembered for this role and also Tommy Jarvis. So
Tommy Jarvis.
Not a bad thing to be. Miguel A. Nunez, a little fun fact, because he does talk about this pretty openly on both Vlad TV when he was interviewed by them and also on this Blu-ray documentary, More Brains. He was absolutely living in a homeless shelter at the time of filming this and Friday the 13th Part 5, because he was pretty much like, okay, this is what I wanted to do. I came to LA and I can't afford it. So I'm now experiencing homelessness. It sucks, but he was like really chipper. Actually, he never let on about any of this stuff. He was just happy to be working. He was just like, hell yeah, this is great. And then once like even Linnea Quigley found out, like, oh my god, he's living in a shelter, that's crazy. But it's like you wouldn't have known. And yeah, and it's just that them's the breaks sometimes, really. But it's just cool to see that he has then been able to build a career for himself, starting from, something like that. It's just like, yeah, that's crazy. This business is wild. So yeah. And that he's at least open about talking about that is something that's cool, which I appreciate. Linnea, as I stated already, had already been in Silent Night, Deadly Night, who had also, the casting director for this movie had cast that movie. So that's pretty much how she got the job, because the actress who they brought in before pretty much got pregnant and she couldn't do the role anymore because trash can't be pregnant. So they brought in Linnea, and obviously, like, why wouldn't you? Duh. But that's exactly what happened with that. And then Jewel Shepard, who was Casey in this movie, she was initially considered for trash, because she does come from a stripper background, at a place where Dan O'Bannon had frequented a little bit. And but she settled on being Casey, the party girl. And from what I gather, I guess, because she was not like a trained actor or anything like this, she may have been complaining a lot on set, you know what I mean? Right. And some other people in the cast maybe would not let her forget that, because they're just like, girl, this is what you signed up for. Like, what the hell? You can't just complain all the time being on a movie set, but it is what it is. But yeah. And then and again, Scuzz doesn't exist, so it's fine. But yeah, that's a little bit about
devoured.
It's just to get devoured. It's fine with me. I will say, I guess, if anything, with that character of Scuzz, like, they didn't it was a premonition, if anything, or it was just like, it was foreshadowing that they didn't actually want him for Scuzz, funny enough. And he did the work to actually show, like, hey, no, I love horror movies and I want to do this. And he did the work to become the character, which is cool. Because the other weird thing about Dan O'Bannon is that I think he kind of wanted people who were punks to be the punks, right? Like, he wanted that. However, caveat to that, not all punks can act. So you have to find people who can, like, do the job of acting, who can show that. So, you tried, Dan O'Bannon, you tried.
Well, but, especially like when you have to like put them in terrifying situations. It's not like Penelope Spheris discovering punks put in like suburbia and stuff like that, where it almost feels documentary style.
Right.
Because they're just doing what they do every day. I mean, Flea was in that movie. Flea was a punk who was just like, I like being in movies.
Yeah.
Throw them in a movie, right? But this, you have to like scare them, chase them, put them through the paces of like water and cemetery and muck and mud. Like, yeah. You need people who are a little bit more committed to the craft.
A little bit, yeah. You do need that. And they were able to find people for that. I think the big thing too, so again, as we stated a little earlier, Dan O'Bannon, again, his product that he made is great. We love the movie. Doing the actual production, he's not much of a actor's director, I feel like, is what's kind of been found from that. I think he was just a guy who was a little bit paranoid All right. Because he loved his guns. He was just a paranoid dude from what it seems like. And I think he was prickly, very prickly from what I understand. So again, it's one of those things where that's the reality of some film sets, is that you just have some directors who honestly they're not the best to work with. And I think he was one of them, it seems like. But again, great writer, I guess. Like
Yeah,
he
I
was
mean,
able to do that, but
when you have
yeah,
creatives like that, you've got a very distinct vision of like what your screenplay is supposed to look like. And the thing I always say about writer directors, auteurs, and why there's so few of them that are actually any good
right.
is because you have to be able to understand that an actor's job is to turn your words into a character. And it might
Exactly.
not be what you envisioned when you were writing it down, but you have to be able to manipulate that into the final package. It can't just be all black and white. Like a
Exactly.
production's an entire gray area. And Michael Crichton stopped directing because of that, because he was having a hard time
Yep.
getting that idea. Like, I created this character and now I'm trying to get this person to play it this way, but they want to do it this way.
Right.
But the best work is when like you let them kind of organically become what they want. So to
Mhm.
kind of get away from that, he started directing other people's screenplays instead of his own.
Yeah.
And those arguably are, to me, are his best works.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's just one of those things. So, I mean, that's what we can talk about when it comes to the directing of this film.
Yeah.
Again, it's great. He wrote this wonderfully, just not the best guy to be on set with all the time. So much so that Clu Gulager wanted to like fucking hit him, you know?
Yeah.
They almost came to blows a couple times. So there's that. I will also say we did mention earlier, so the special effects of this movie initially were going to be done by an artist, Bill Munn, and also William Stout as well. He was the production designer, so he was a little bit a part of that. But Bill Munn was supposed to be the special effects guy, right?
Mhm.
That's what he was kind of supposed to be. And they then brought in like Kenny Myers and Tony Gardner as well, and they brought in a couple other team people. But let's just say, because you have watched the More Brains documentary, right? Because you have the
Yes.
same thing I do.
Yes.
Let's just say that he was on the documentary. I will say that. Oh, also jump scare warning in case you have the same thing that me and Antonio have. Brian Peck also narrates that documentary, so that's gross.
It's
But
cringe.
otherwise, it's cringe, yeah, and he's in it. Like it's annoying, and you're just like, ugh, gross. But it is still a very good documentary. It's like 2 hours. It tells you a lot of shit. It's where I'm getting a lot of this stuff from. Again, cringe though. Just saying, jump scare warning. But anyway, but Bill Munn, let's just say if I had, because I just watched it like 2 nights ago, he definitely was you could tell me what you think, Antonio. He brought some good points down of like why it sounded like to me he was making excuses a lot of the time for why maybe this didn't work out. But yeah, what are your kind of thoughts on what Bill Munn did with the effects a little bit? Because yeah, it was a thing, man.
I mean, it was a thing, but also, this is a guy that comes from the Stuart Gordon, or not the Stuart Gordon. This is a guy that comes from the Don Coscarelli School of Filmmaking because he did Beastmaster just a few years earlier. So it's a lot of just like kind of hands-on, low budget, cheap aesthetics and stuff like that. And I always wonder what happens when you give those guys money that they never worked with before, and
Right.
the ambition that comes behind it, where you've got like a bigger picture to work on. Therefore, you have higher expectations. I feel like that really kind of turns personalities a little bit weird and almost egomaniacal, which kind of sounds, where this one is.
Yeah, I can kind of agree with that. Again, it seems like because at some point, like William Stout had these like ideas of like, okay, here's what this should look like, and here's what this should look like, and da da da. And it's just that the product that Bill Munn was giving, it was not giving.
Right.
And
like the bald cap stuff and the wigs that he wanted to
Yeah.
put on people. Absolutely.
Yep. The headless zombie that gets his head cut off. That whole thing, like, it just was not very well done. And it was just like, okay, bro, like this is not working. And Dan O'Bannon kind of had to, because I think William Stout, he was the one who kind of raised the flag of like, okay, this is a joke. Like, this is not going to work for what we need. So, like, we need to have a conversation. And they ended up firing Bill Munn off of this project. And so then they ended up bringing in Kenny Myers, who ended up finishing it. And also Tony Gardner as well was a part of that. And everyone else who was on that team as well. But yeah, and I'm glad for that, because then you have, but I mean, technically Bill Munn did do some credit with stuff. Like, he is the guy who did do some of the Tarman stuff, like that wonderful costume that he has, and all that. So, I mean, it's just like, this is a zombie movie that needs to have good special effects for it to work. But I'm glad it worked itself out, if anything. I like that.
I will say that there are some inconsistencies throughout the movie where you can tell the quality of product is vastly different. But, I'm sure half of it was already in the can. They're not going to go back and redo it or refilm it. They don't have the budget for that.
Right.
But lucky for them, this is a genre movie, and people are more forgiving when you're a campy genre movie than if you are trying to do serious. Like, you can't make an alien film and have the xenomorph look different halfway through the movie because you shot it earlier.
Right, it's not going to work.
And that happened. Like, they shot it with like a translucent skull for the first few weeks, and they decided they didn't like that, and they went and reshot all of it with like the sleeker skull.
Right.
So you can do that. You can get away with more on campy genre films than you can with ones that are supposed to be a little bit more serious in tone.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree too. Like, it's just all that. Do you have any other like fun little like things you might have gleaned from this production or anything like that before we kind of move into anything having to do with like the plot and characters?
So I'm going to give Dan O'Bannon some credit, though, as a writer really fast, because he does, I'm sure it's part of his punch up, his rewrite, whatever, that you can see some similarities in this and his Alien script. Now, first of all, the campiness of these characters and the silliness in such like a serious, horror type concept of, zombies and living dead, it kind of works because O'Bannon co-wrote and starred in the film Dark Star with John Carpenter, which was essentially like a silly outer space comedy where they're like a demolition crew. They blow up planets and they deal with like this alien that it's a beach ball essentially that, is always causing mischief around the ship, and they're trying to chase it. So that's kind of like the metamorphosis that would go into their script called Star Beast, which eventually became Alien. Now, that script for Star Beast had a lot of like silliness in it, and it was all male characters. And then they kept some of that in the Yaphet Kotto and Harry Dean Stanton character. Like, some of the funny one-liners and stuff are given to them. But there's something that I really recognized in this a long time ago, where I love how Dan O'Bannon's stakes are so much higher when he makes these movies. Because one of the things that makes Alien so ominous is that you can't kill it because it bleeds acid. It'll destroy the ship and you're all going to die. So it's a very, very challenging villain to deal with. Well, in this version of the zombie lore, you can't burn these things because once they disintegrate or get burnt up, that chemical, that trioxin chemical that causes zombies, then goes into the atmosphere, lands either in acid rain or on the ground, and then causes these things to reanimate from the cemetery. So that's another high stakes thing that we're dealing with. A similar concept where your villain is harder to kill, but also you don't want to kill it because you could just be creating more danger for yourself later down the road. That's a plot point that a lot of screenwriters don't use, and it seems to be like the O'Bannon special, and I love that.
Yeah, no, totally. And of course, if anybody didn't already know, trioxin, this thing that, is this chemical from the government, from the army, it is a direct reference to Agent Orange, pretty much, which was used during the Vietnam War to literally decimate, Vietnamese people and all that, to literally deform them. So I think that's also a theme.
Soldiers, American soldiers too.
Yeah, totally.
Watch
so much
Jacob's Ladder.
I fucking love Jacob's Ladder. It's so good. Yeah, please watch that movie. Oh my god, best Macaulay Culkin role. Fight me. But no, it's true, and so much so that people are still fighting about it today. Where like soldiers who dealt with that are still dealing with the shit. So I think that's definitely a theme talking about that. You know what I mean?
And the last part too about Dan O'Bannon is like, I love how right now everyone is arguing about in the Alien universe, since we have Romulus out, that the xenomorphs aren't the villain, it's the company. It's like, yeah, was always the case. It was always the bureaucrats that were the ones that were the villains. They're the ones that caused it. They're the ones that made it worse. Well, in this case, it's the same thing. It's the army. It's the army that developed this chemical. It's the army that shut it down. It's the army that lost these crates and barrels full of zombies and then lost track of them. And the point that they have, like, if you find this canister, call this number, call the army at 1-800. Like, that's just a brilliant thing. But again, the incompetence of our bureaucratic agencies is the real villain in this movie. It's also the way the film climaxes is, because of what they have done and what they have to do as a recourse. The undead, they are just a byproduct of the bureaucratic incompetence. And that's another thing that this movie, I think, does cleverly, because it doesn't make it the obvious point. But if you've seen enough of these movies, or if you've dealt with government agencies, you're like, oh shit, it's the army that's the villain here, not the zombies.
Yeah, I do think there's a case to be made for that as well. And then environmentalism as well, I think, is in there too, because of the whole thing with acid rain. This is something that had been brought up before too. So I definitely think there's a case to be made where they're kind of also commenting on just environmentalism in general, but definitely also taking down like just the kind of military complex as we know it anyway. So I thought that was very interesting too.
Indeed.
Let's talk a little bit about this plot. So I guess if you had to explain to someone, Antonio, just a condensed, chicken soup for the soul version, if you had to tell somebody maybe what this movie is about, maybe who's never seen it, how would you describe this movie to somebody who's never seen it before?
Oh, especially if you're like explaining it to like the current generations, like the younger ones. It's like, okay, there was a time where no one had phones or tablets.
Exactly.
And so teenagers were out just looking for shit to do, causing chaos, being punks, busting into cemeteries, dancing naked on crypts.
Yep.
But hey, there's the one guy that's got to like earn a $1 bill. So he goes and he gets a job at a medical supply facility, essentially. Yeah. That has cadavers and skeletons and other things like that. Freddie is new to this job, and James Karen is like his supervisor. Clue Gallagher is the owner.
Yep.
And James Karen is like, okay, this is what we do. We send a skeleton with teeth. I love that they all come from India. It's a very interesting thing. The piece of dialogue there is like, how do all these people from India have perfect teeth? I'm like, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I don't know. Exactly.
And then he's like, hey, you want to see something scary? Which is how a lot of good horror movies kind of start off.
Right, exactly.
And he tells him the story that the Night of the Living Dead is actually a government cover-up. They hired Romero, almost like how they, hired Stanley Kubrick to cover up the moon landing.
Exactly, right. Right.
It's that same kind of like conspiracy theorist mind. They go down to the basement. It's like, we got a few of these canisters. They look in there. And again, back to the whole like bureaucratic failure of this, where Freddie's like, dude, should you be like knocking those canisters around? He's like, oh, this is good old fashioned American hardware. Taps it 3 times and the glass breaks, saturates them with this trioxin chemical.
Yep.
Plus whatever zombie goo has been in these cases with them.
Right.
And as they slowly start to change, all of the medical experiments start coming back to life. What do? They call Clue Gallagher. He says, look, we got to burn this shit. We'll take it to my friend Ernie's place. They burn it. It goes up through the chimney, falls into the cemetery in acid rain, and it causes the animation of these corpses. Cue, do you want to pop?
Yes. It's amazing. Love that.
Which interrupts, the cemetery hangout of these punks where Trash has like almost like a Shakespearean soliloquy about how she fantasizes about death and what her biggest fear is.
Yeah.
How she would be killed by rotting old men tearing her clothes off and eating her alive.
Right.
Well, she gets her wish because that's what happens.
That's exactly what happens.
And then it's like a survival game, right? Everyone has to survive. They get separated. Tina, who is Freddie's girl, ends up back in the place, meets the tar man who we saw mysteriously for a second in that. And then it does kind of go to the old fashioned Romero tropes of like, let's board up the walls, protect ourselves from these things. But it's also funny too, because like these zombies are literally sentient and they're like getting on the horn saying, send more ambulance men, send more cops, you know?
So good.
Yeah. So it's good. So you can have your zombie tropes from the Romero movies, but you can also have this punk rock added soundtrack, likable characters that even the the minute characters have their moments, right? They're not just zombie fodder until they are. And that makes it great, you know? And James Karen, man, like that, those two, Freddie and James Karen's character, their transition and the way it goes, where one becomes a zombie and the other one essentially finds a way around it, which is maybe a 90-second scene, but it's so poignant as well.
Yeah.
It's just a great all-encompassing punk rock zombie movie for the 80s.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a pretty good plot summary, if anything. It's really about like, this thing happens. These punks have to like fucking get together with these people and try to save the day. But guess what? No one saves the day because they all die in the end. So such as this. And then tying it back to Night of the Living Dead, that's exactly kind of how that movie ends, where you think Dwayne Jones is going to live, and spoiler, he doesn't. So gets killed. It's interesting how that kind of all works together. We gotta talk about some of these main characters though. I guess I'll start with mine. Like, I think some of my favorite characters in this, I mean, I will say I can't just say everybody, right? But I really do think like out of all of these folks, I think my favorite one for me is definitely Spider. I just like him. I think he is just somebody who has his head on the most straight out of all these punks, I guess. You're kind of like, oh, okay, cool. Like, but he's also like the one who's taken some charge and he's able to like make it almost to the end, which is cool. And I just really like him, and I think he is a fairly dynamic character in this. And it was also cool to see in 1985 that a black man can make it almost to the end of the movie. Like, that's awesome too. Because again, we also have Night of the Living Dead, where literally Dwayne Jones is a boss in that movie and he's fantastic in it, but like, it's cool to see Miguel Nunez able to kind of step into those shoes a little bit, and be able to take some charge and shit, and be able to deal with this bullshit that's going on. He's my favorite. I mean, I must say, but I do like a lot of these adult characters. I do think James Cameron, wow. James Cameron. I think James Cameron's role of, what was his name again? He's not Bert or Ernie. He's I'm trying to remember. What's his name again?
It's Frank.
It's Frank. There you go. Yeah. Cause I was like, wait, there's Bert and Ernie, and then there's who is it? It's Frank. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Frank, it's funny to me that he wants to like try to quote fit in with his like younger coworker, I guess. Which is just funny to me, but like ultimately he does care about all of this, and he is able to like, I don't know, he doesn't want to die. And even like his I love the way he kind of takes himself out in a way, because he ends up is he the one that burns himself in the crematorium, or is that the other guy?
Yes.
But like,
no, that's him.
That's him.
That's what I was saying. Like, he finds a way to get around turning, because he sees what he's, and I think that's why those scenes are so important, where we do get to see the dismembered cadaver from the facility, and then we see the old woman who's been torn in half and feels herself rotting. He sees what the end game is, and I love that is his choice, where he's like, I don't want to take any of these people out.
Right.
And I know I'm a danger to everyone, so I'm going to just like take the noble way out. It's almost like a samurai thing, where it's like,
harikari or something.
Serve no more purpose in this world. He's in a harikari, exactly.
Yeah, no, totally. I completely agree, and I think he does it fantastically. He's just so good. Who's your favorite character in this, if you had to say, or favorite characters?
I have to say that Clu Gulager, James Karen, and then what's his name, Ernie, Don Calfa as Ernie.
Yeah,
I consider them all like just one character. Like, they have their own things, but they're supposed to represent the man, right? They're supposed to represent that older generation that don't understand these punks. The punks don't understand them. So when it comes down to brass tacks, they're all kind of like the same unit.
Yeah.
They all have different deaths, of course, but I appreciate that aspect of it because the movie was not meant for us to follow them. It was meant to follow the punks because that's the generation it was made for. So
Yeah,
of
no,
those,
totally.
Spider's my favorite, 100%. And then Trash. Like Trash is such an iconic. Trash is the character that ends up on T-shirts. Trash is the character
She
that ends up
is.
as almost like the name and the face of this movie, even though she's not the featured character.
Yeah.
But she's also kind of given like that secondary sexy zombie role, which we'll talk about, another entry in this series that I'm a huge fan of. But
right.
They don't turn her into like a total monster.
Yeah.
There's like perfect like kind of trickery where the homeless guy sees her through the shadows and she's still sexy and she's nude. And then we get the close up of her face and she's got zombie face. It's like, I mean, I still would, but
I get it. Understandable. Yeah. And what I think is also cool too is that someone like Trash, like, yes, it's Linnea Quigley, and yes, her body's perfect, obviously. I mean, of course. But I also kind of like that they have this, but then also you have this like near the end, she's also Donald Ducking it throughout the movie because she doesn't have clothes on half the time, and then she like has to get clothes at some point. But I kind of love that she has that moment of like she's terrified now, and also like when she's killed by the zombies, it's like she gets to show that like she doesn't want to die. She was talking this game before of like, don't you wonder what it would be like to die? And then now that she's finally going to die, like she's scared like everybody else is. She's not this like
her tonal shift is great.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think
I think bonus points too to Mark Venturini is Suicide because
I agree.
He's not a huge part of the film. Like he's just the guy with the car. And they give him a very great character building moment where he has his own soliloquy of like, don't people understand? This isn't just like a choice. This is a lifestyle. And he's talking about his chains and his hoops and his clothes. And it's like, I've worked really hard to build this lifestyle for myself. And y'all just care about my car.
Yeah.
Like,
No,
it's
totally.
so not punk rock to complain about that. But it does give him like a little bit more of a grounded characterization.
Yeah.
So I think those two kind of have like a symbiotic relationship as they're the more extreme of the group.
Yeah.
But he wants nothing to do with her. He's like, get off me, man, dude. He calls her man and dude.
Which I love. That's so funny. Oh my God. You're almost like, so we need to know about you, Suicide. I don't know.
Right. Suicide. You got more going on.
You got more going on? You like you some men? I mean, hey, I like it. It's all good. Yeah, I know. I agree. For sure. For sure. Do you have any like particular standout scenes for this? I guess my standout scenes, I mean, if anything, obviously is the graveyard dance, because who doesn't love seeing Linnea Quigley like naked? You know what I love about her too is that talking about that More Brains documentary, which might be on Screenbox if you look and you use that service, it might be on there too. I wish it was out more. Like I wish it wasn't just on the Blu-ray. I kind of, even though Brian Peck did narrate it or whatever, like I wish it was out there a little more because I think it has some really good information. Similar to like that Pennywise documentary that talks about the 1990s. That was a really good one too. But I kind of wish it was out there a little bit more. But anyway, what I love about Linnea Quigley is that she was so nonchalant about her nudity in any of her movies. And it's funny, I watched that and I was like, she never really thought anything much about the nudity in any of the films that she did. And she literally was like, well, my dad was a doctor, so I never really thought anything about it. Like, and I was like, that's a perfect encapsulation, Linnea Quigley. Like, perfect. Because you're hot, you have a good body, but you're also just like, yeah, my dad was a doctor. Like, I don't see the body as like this thing that's like super like prescient. Do you know what I mean? And if anything, like if you think I'm hot and you want to see me naked, okay, great. You're gonna give me more money to be in this movie. And I'll give you the show you're looking for. There you go. I love that. Good for her.
Me too. Remember she had like an aerobics video.
She did.
Yeah.
The horror workout.
It was like a horror workout. I mean, she really knew how to brand herself and still
100%.
does,
100%. Right. Oh, love it. We just don't have those people anymore, really. Like we don't have a contemporary person who is willing to take that. So, if only.
Yeah. Well, You know what? I think the last one that could have been was Elizabeth Berkley in Showgirls. And
I
they
know.
buried her so harshly for that no one dared to step up again. And that's when we started getting like the direct to video type people like Misty Munday and all those people like that. They weren't allowed to be in prestige productions like we were making in the 80s. After they buried Elizabeth Berkley, I feel that's where like that audience split, where we can't have that kind of performer in mainstream anymore. We have to put them in the bowels of this direct to video or mail order performer. And it's a sad thing because, you know, I feel that if Mia Goth wasn't such a prestige actress apart from the X trilogy, I think she could be the one. But she's already such an amazing established actress on top of it. It would be looked at as like, oh, well, she's taking a step down, you know?
Yeah, no, totally. Or even someone like Sydney Sweeney, where I'm like, you know, we could see that of like, I don't know, not saying that everyone needs to get naked all the time, but it's just interesting where someone doesn't see it as like, oh, look at me being so sexy. It's part of that, but it's also like it informs this character or whatever. And it's so interesting you tie that back to Showgirls, because I think you're right, because we didn't really see it after that. And erotic thrillers are not the same as they were and all this stuff. It's so interesting how that ties together. Like, yeah, no, you're totally right. Like, and it's just like, yeah, I haven't watched it yet, but my friend Pickens, who loves this kind of shit, he told me about a documentary where it follows Linnea Quigley, Brink Stevens, and I think Michelle Bauer, running in high heels or something called like that. He mentioned it on an episode, but like, I do kind of want to watch that little documentary because it's those scream queens. I don't know. We do kind of have scream queens a little bit still, but like also like,
yeah, but it's not the same.
It's not the same, right?
There's studio movies, you know?
Yeah.
Like Jenna Ortega is essentially a screen queen now,
she is,
right? But we're not gonna see her in a role like this. If she did do a role like this, I'd be like, damn, hats off.
Oh, absolutely.
You're on goddamn Netflix right now doing Wednesday Addams and you know
what's
like
funny?
One of those crazy things.
You know what's funny? Sorry to interrupt, but like, you know what's funny? We're also going on a little bit of a tangent, but it's fine. I really wish this for him. And look, I have not seen Strange Darling yet, but I'm gonna tell you what, if we want a male version of that, I'm totally fine with seeing Kyle Gallner like show ass and like all this. Like, I am fine with that because first off, I think he's kind of sexy, but also like, I feel like he also can get into like, he will lose himself in this character that is. I always think he's really, really interesting and dynamic to watch. So I don't know. I also want to see, Kyle Gallner, show more ass, please. We might want to see your dong. I don't know yet, but we'll see. Like,
just
do it.
Go full Saltburn with it.
Fuck yeah. Fuck yeah. Like, that's what I'm saying. I'm just like, you just don't have that as much. And the thing is that this movie is very well known for that graveyard scene. So we got to talk about it. But also it's the thing of like, you know, it does tie back to like, we'll talk about that near the end of like, you know, could this movie be made again? But still, it's like, I don't know. Anyway. But yeah, do you have any like standout scenes or anything before we move on with our conversation?
I think it has one of the best horror reveals of all time, and that's the Tarman brain scene.
Yep.
Because O'Bannon does one of my favorite horror tropes. You know, they do it in Jaws, they do it in Night of the Creeps. Hitchcock perfected it.
Yep.
And that is the pull zoom. So when he comes out of the curtain and he says brains and he licks his lips, and then it does that pull zoom on Tina as she has a silent screen.
Right.
If I had to say like top 5 horror moment reveals, that's in it for sure. Like that's to me, that's the movie. That's the reveal right there. That and Trash on the Crypt are like the two things that really makes me think about this film.
I agree.
But also, man, I've said it 4 times in this conversation. The I can feel myself rot scene is such a poignant moment where they actually made body horror like poignant and emotional, and it was a goddamn animatronic, right? It wasn't even like a real person.
It was
but that performance, puppet performance, and just the way that everyone reacts to those lines of dialogue, I'm like, that's elevated horror in this goddamn movie, and I love it. It's like one of my favorite horror scenes of all time. It's right up there with Bub discovering music for the first time in his headphones. Like,
I
where you're like,
agree.
oh my God, I have the feels for a goddamn zombie.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that actor is fantastic, by the way. The one who plays Bob. Love him. But like he no, I totally agree that like yeah, that is a really good scene too. I really love that. And also, like we said, James Karen burning himself, that's a whole thing too.
Mm-hmm.
And just yeah, there's some good scenes in here for sure. For sure, for sure. So, talking a little bit about just like, okay, we talked about the film, we talked about some of the scenes in it, characters, all that good stuff. But as we start to, get through a quarter of the way done almost, I feel like, what do you think about like after this movie came out, do you have anything to say about like the reception of this movie and kind of how it was taken by critics at the time or anything? Do you have anything to kind of share about that? Or maybe how it might have affected other movies after it coming forward or going forward?
So absolutely, in the sense of like, this was generally well received. It was a pleasant surprise because people didn't expect for this to be actually a good movie. Like, oh, it's just more horror fodder, more let's eat brains movies. Or Siskel and Ebert during this stage of the 80s were so just anti horror because
Oh yeah.
they were making horror on the same equivalent as every horror movie is a slasher movie.
Yeah.
And even films like Fright Night, which, Roger defended, but Gene hated, he just thought that every horror movie where it was a vampire, werewolf, zombie, slasher, whatever, he put them all into just one dumb
category.
Teenagers having sex and getting killed, blah, blah, blah. And Roger was the defender of some of these. So I think America, right? You'd have people that understood the irony of the movies and what they were trying to do and say and creating these new audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just had the other half that was like super conservative and like, oh, we don't need this filth in our theaters and in our kids' bedrooms and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally.
Which is why we don't talk about Return of the Living Dead 2 too often, because it did the traditional studio stereotypical cliche where they had to course correct. They had a hit on their hands. So what do? Instead of doubling down on the horror, violence, and sex, they tone it back so they can get a wider audience. They put goddamn kids in that movie and make it almost like a Monster Squad Junior kind of story.
Right.
And I hate Return of the Living Dead 2. I hate that movie.
Yeah.
Because they sanitize it. They try to course correct it. And I was like, fuck you.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, no, it's absolutely correct. And even we talk about like the consensus. So on Rotten Tomatoes, this is quote, a punk take on the zombie genre to Return of the Living Dead injects a healthy dose of 80s silliness to the flesh consuming. And I think that's what really works about this. Like you were saying, this was well received by people. And even Roger Ebert said, he gave it a 3 out of 4. He said that this film is kind of a sensation machine made out of the usual ingredients. And the real question is whether it's done with style. And it is. So like, yeah, I mean, he wasn't always the best with horror, but he knew class when he saw it. He knew good when he saw it. And we always have to remember that he also made Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. So, I mean,
Which I use that all the time. I think every episode I'm like, he hated this movie, yet he wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Come on. Get out of here with this.
Get out of here.
He did defend things that were daring to be a little bit more original. Like he loved Fright Night. He's like, no one's made a vampire movie like this. He's like,
it's
how
so
can you not
good.
see the originality of this, right?
Agreed. Yeah. Oh, it's so good. I love that movie so much. Because like really this is like Fright Night is one of my favorite vampire movies, if not my favorite, not just because of the homoerotic undertones, that's a part of it, but also like, and also putting someone like the guy who is Roddy Piper, right? He's the guy who's in that, if I'm not mistaken. Something, I don't know.
In Fright Night?
Yeah.
No, Roddy McDowell.
Oh, that guy.
Roddy McDowell is Peter Vincent. Yeah.
I was like, Roddy Piper,
Cornelius
Roddy McDowell.
From Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, that guy.
Like Roddy McDowell is They Live.
Yeah. Right. Of course. So yes, but that guy who was like, I think also gay in real life, like came into this role. again, it's so cool. And I just love that. But this is like my favorite zombie movie. And I think I mentioned it a little earlier, but it's because it mixes horror and comedy really well. And,
Yeah, it does.
you gotta like that for what it is. You gotta get with that. Do you feel like, do you feel like there's other, we'll talk about the sequels in just a minute. Do you feel like this, I mean, I guess this movie is where you have the inception of fast moving zombies, but then also zombies that want brains, obviously. But what other kind of pieces of media do you see maybe are harkening back to, or who are influenced by like Return of the Living Dead? If you had to kind of name any of them.
It's an interesting question, and I could nerd out for a second, but I would say that this is like the first recognized instance of fast moving zombies.
Sure.
The one that I think is my earliest example is a film from the 70s called Messiah of Evil that
Okay.
has fast moving zombies that chase a woman through a grocery store and movie theaters and streets. But they're not Romero type zombies, so people didn't give it a lot of credit. But
Right.
definitely, I hate that people say that 28 Days Later was like, oh, they have fast zombies. I'm like, no, we've had fast zombies before. You just weren't paying attention.
Exactly. Right.
Every zombie movie made has probably got something that was, I'm not going to say lifted directly from this, but this covered so much ground, it'd be hard not to say there
Right.
was. What I think is interesting is my generation, we had a video game in the 80s put out by LucasArts called Maniac Mansion.
Okay.
Not sure if you're familiar with it. It
No,
was one
I'm
of those
not.
old point and click adventure games. It's a real 80s thing. People just love this shit. Now, it was about weird mad scientists and alien tentacles inside this mansion, but you got to select your characters to play that would go into this mansion and try and like solve puzzles. These characters in this game are literally carbon copies of the characters in this movie. Like there's a guy that looks like Suicide. There's a guy that looks like Scuzz. There's a girl that looks like Tina. Like it really is, in my opinion, a carbon copy of that. So I'd say that's the more obscure reference that you would see in future media is they took those character archetypes from this movie and put them in this game. And so people that know that game and not this movie, if they ever like watched and played them together or whatever, they'd be like, oh my God, you're right. It's one of those aha moments that I had when I was in my youth. I'm like, oh my God, it's just the cast from Return of the Living Dead. So that's my special addition to this influence conversation.
Yeah, no, totally. I didn't even know about that, but that's so funny you bring that up. And yeah, I think like this movie has really permeated kind of the horror sphere because of that. And I think that just kind of lends to its kind of cult fandom, if you will, and all of that. And that's why it's had an influence on the zombie genre. Similar to how something like I would argue that even before like John Hughes had the teen movie at a chokehold. I think the big movie that kind of really did something for teen films at the time was Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I think that was a
Yeah.
huge one. Even before that, you have something like Rock and Roll High School, which is a little more under the radar, but because I just covered that one and I love that movie. But it's one of these things where you see a sea change with something like Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And then once you have John Hughes, he just kind of perfected this thing that really spoke to a lot of people. And that's what kind of turned teen movies for a certain time. And then, all that. So I think the same thing kind of happened with this, where you have Return of the Living Dead, which was just this mix of comedy and horror, but it was all there. And then moving forward, you're trying to get back to that. And whether you are successful or not, I guess depends. But, yeah, and then you have like it's not until like the 2000s where you do have a success like 28 Days Later that ended up hitting at a certain time, where I think then people are like, oh, like this is what zombies are now. And then we can even tie that into then a couple years after that, you have The Walking Dead. And that's where we're at, even today. And then with The Last of Us and things like that. So it's just interesting how we can kind of tie that into it. You did speak on the sequel. I did want to give you the floor a little bit. So you hate the sequel, but you do also have a case to make for Night of the Living Dead 3. Please, give me your manifesto about that.
It's not as much as a manifesto, but I have a very special love in my heart for Return of the Living Dead 3, not just because it has the absolute most beautiful, gorgeous, sexy female zombie of all time in Miss Melinda Clark. It's the movie that made me just fall in love with goth girls, right? It's like, oh my God, she's in black leather. She's got
Hell
pierced
yeah.
nipples. I'm already getting flustered
Amazing.
just talking about it. Julie Walker, man. What I did like about part 3 is it took us back to the horror element, but it also was a daring move and did a Romeo and Juliet take on the zombie lore, where we have a guy who is reanimating his girlfriend, which was killed by mistake, mostly his fault.
Mm-hmm.
But his dad works for the military. They're still messing with this trioxin shit. And he's seen what it does. He's seen, it may as well be like Wayland Yutani trying to make more aliens when they know that it's a bad idea, but they still do it, right?
Right.
And then seeing her in one of the best horror female performances of all time in this 90-minute movie, transition from punk rock girl into like, in this movie, this is killing me. I'm in agony. I'm dying. And then she goes full on predatory at the end.
Right.
It's just a great character dynamic. And it's a throwaway movie to most people. But for the people that know about it, it's like, this movie is tight. It's well paced. The performances are good. It's got a lot of great kills. And you added the sex appeal to a zombie movie. Like,
yeah,
it got people wanting, like, I want to fuck a zombie. Like, really
right.
People thinking that way.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's just something where, yeah, no, I totally get that. So what Antonio is trying to tell you, everybody, watch Return of the Living Dead and then skip the part 2 and just watch part 3. And that's pretty much that. Because the ones that come after part 3 are also apparently not good either. I have not seen them, nor do I plan
They're
to.
made for video garbage.
Yeah, we're not doing that. Like, I'm not doing that. It's not happening. But yeah, no, I will definitely check out part 3 because I've been meaning to. So, your glowing recommendation of it is enough for me, if anything. But yeah,
well, how about this?
Yeah.
Let's earmark it on our calendar, right? Because I want to do Return of the Living Dead 3 as my Valentine's Day episode in 2025.
Ooh.
So how about you watch that movie, and then if all things permitted, but you don't get blown up by a meteor or a nuclear war or some shit,
I know, right?
You can be my guest on Valentine's Day and let me know your thoughts on what I think is the most romantic zombie movie of all time.
We'll talk offline about it. I'm amenable to it for sure. Because it would also be fun for me to be a first time watcher because you love the movie and I have never seen it, so it'd be interesting to have that for sure. I like that.
Yeah, those are my favorite conversations. the uninitiated, bringing them into the fold.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, I think as we start to wrap up though a little bit, I think my show isn't always about like is it a cult classic or not? It's not always like that because there's so many different definitions of what that is, so it's kind of hard to pin something down. But Antonio, I kind of want to.
I'm in the same thought as you.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to do that. But Antonio, I want to know from you, like, why do you think this movie has had this kind of lasting impact and this lasting legacy in the horror genre and in the cult genre, if you will? Why has it had this? And, what do you want? Do you feel like a movie like this could come out today? Do you feel like we won't ask the dreaded remake question ever. We could talk a little bit about it, but I know, right? But it's like, but what do you think? Like, do you think a movie like this could work today? And I just want to know kind of your thoughts of like, why has this had the legacy that it's had, you think?
My my answer is layered to this, and it might be a little bit, I don't know, it might be a little bit condescending to the industry. It might be a little bit esoteric and out there, but I'll kind of give you my thoughts on this. If you were to make this film the exact same way, just with the modern day technologies, but same kind of actors, same kind of story, everything the same, no, I don't think it would work in theaters because theaters wouldn't push it up. The industry doesn't want stuff like this anymore. Throw it on streaming as like a throwback, like they did with Stranger Things. Stranger Things opened up a whole new can of worms of introducing things to these younger generations, where us older generations were like, okay, yeah, I like Stranger Things, but we're looking at it nostalgically because it's taking bites of everything that we grew up with and loved, like Firestarter and It and Stand By Me. Like, it's taking all these things that we've loved and it's creating them in a new package for younger generations. People get kind of hungry for that. So I think that a zombie series played with this energy and these kind of characters probably would work, because people can watch it anytime. They can binge it if they want. They can have parties with it. Like you said earlier, the effort that it takes to go see something theatrically now is so inconvenient. It's so annoying. And people just kind of suck these days. And for us that got locked up for a few months or a year during COVID, it's changed some of our dynamics of how we interact socially, where before I'd want to be elbow to elbow with a person in a theater so we could laugh and scream and get excited at the same shit. And now it's like, okay, where's the most secluded seat that I can find as I'm pre-purchasing my tickets and showing up 20 minutes after the start time because I know there's going to be trailers. Like, it's just kind of killed the whole excitement of going to the movies. So that's kind of like my backward answer is like, this could work, but not theatrically. It'd probably work on something streaming. It'd probably work on maybe like a web series or something like that, like how Cobra Kai started, right? Started as a web series, got those nostalgia bait people getting into it, and then it turns into something bigger, and now it's iconic. That's how I could see it.
I agree. I think this could work as a series or something, or yeah, like to kind of give something to make it something for today's, kids or whatever. I don't know. Just or horror fans that are maybe younger or whatever it is. I mean, I really think like this movie, the reason it has like the impact it has had, I've said it before, but like it is kind of a perfect amalgamation of both horror and comedy, which I just really appreciate. And I don't think there's been a movie like it a whole lot since that have done it so well. I mean, of course, you have something like Scream, which is really cool. And it's able to kind of have a little bit of that horror and comedy together. But, I think this one really kind of goes for the gusto, which I really appreciate. And I think if anything, like it's nice that, someone like John A. Russo was able to, I think he got exactly what he wanted out of this, which is he wanted to be different than George A. Romero. And that was a really big thing for him because he ultimately was a friend of his and he wanted to be able to differentiate himself from that. And I think he got exactly what he wanted. And I really love that because that's great. And, I think if anything, like, people come back to this again, it really only has kind of one blemish on it that we can't help because the guy got cast, but other than that, like I really think like this is my favorite zombie movie. It's something where I'm glad I bought it, like to the highest of quality I could really try to get it at, and it's something where I would wholly sing the praises of this film. And I just think it's so good. And it's just something where it is a cult movie. I absolutely think so. It's kind of just a horror classic at this point, I guess, but yeah, I just enjoy it. And I think it is something where I'm happy that the person who helped create it, I think, got his wish in the end. He was able to respect a friend of his and and be able to differentiate himself, where whether you like the sequels or not or whatever the hell it is, they made a pretty good product, and this goes down in history as one of the best zombie films in my opinion. So I think that's what I got to say about that, really. I mean, truly. But Antonio, it's been so nice to talk to you about this. I love your knowledge you've brought and just the love that you have for this movie. And it's been nice to be able to talk to you about it. And I'm glad we had this conversation today, for sure.
Yeah, I'm finally glad that we were able to do it because it's been on the list for months and the anticipation was killing me.
I know. I was just, I don't know. I'm just edging people at this point. I'm sorry about that. Oh, well, it's fine. But thank you so much for coming on. But yeah, that's wrapping up on good old Return of the Living Dead. So we already did our socials from beginning of the show and everything. I will say for next week, so you're hearing this right around the end of October, so next month or next week will be the end of October actually, and I'm going to be ending it with another banger that also is about not about zombies, it's more about demons, I guess. And I'm going to be covering a little movie called Night of the Demons from 1988. I definitely wanted to cover this, so I thought, what better time to do it than on right around spooky season. So you'll be hearing that next week. I know I hope you enjoy this movie, Antonio. So,
Oh, you're giving people a Linnea Quigley double feature.
Yes, I am. Oh my God, how could I not? But yeah, so I'll have a fun guest on for that, and it'll be cool, and I'm excited to talk about that fantastic film as well. So yeah, and then that's
Hot take,
spooky.
Hot take. Night of the Demons 2 is better, but that's just my opinion.
I kind of agree a little bit, but that's just me too. You throw Christine Taylor in a movie and I'm down for it, man. Like, it's awesome. No, I kind of agree with it as well, but yeah, no, we're gonna talk about the OG next week though, but it's gonna be fun. So I like that. But as always, thank you for taking the time to listen to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast. And remember,
send more paramedics.
Take care. Bye.